Welcome to the morning session. Thanks a lot for coming. There's a lot of parallel sessions going on today, so I know that it's hard to sometimes choose. In this talk, what I wanted to do was kind of take a step back and have a look at the progress that we made in the hydrogen project. So this isn't a very technical presentation regarding the actual controller and the platform and the code, but it's more about the project and the process. And what I'm going to do is try to use a lot of data and graphs to sort of substantiate the progress that we've made in OpenDaylight. So if a lot of graphs bore you, this may not be the talk for you. But if data interests you, this may be a good something that you'll find interesting. So, I was kind of inspired to do this talk by the speech that the chairman of OpenDaylight, Inder Gopal, gave last year at the Open Networking Summit. So I have this clip.
Ultimately, though, I think you'll have to judge us by our...
Okay, let me start it again.
Ultimately, though, I think you'll have to judge us by our actions, right? Not by our words. And, I think over the next few months, what you will see is a very open, a very participatory process that is definitely not going to be driven by a few large vendors. And then, of course, the most important thing, right, is creating a community around this, right? I mean, the success of any open source project is based upon the community of developers that coalesce around the particular project. And to have that thriving community is something that we would see as one of our primary goals. So you should come back in 2 years and grade us. And, hoping we'll get an A+, but we'll see.
Okay, so Inder suggested that we come back and take a look at OpenDaylight 2 years later. So we're almost 1 year in from that point in time when we launched OpenDaylight last April. So maybe we can consider this kind of like a midterm exam, taking stock of how far we've gotten during that period. And if you recall, when we started the project, there was a lot of concern and a little bit of angst about transparency and agendas of various participants. And so that's what Inder is referring to when he talks about the openness and the transparency of the project and the process. So I'm not going to talk a lot about that part, but I am going to talk about other ways to evaluate the project. So the focus of this talk is really trying to take an outside-in look at OpenDaylight. So I've been an insider in OpenDaylight since day one, or maybe day -1, as we're bringing the consortium together. But if you take a step back and sort of look at it from the outside using metrics that you would maybe use to judge the progress of a project, it's interesting to see where we are, compared to where we'd like to be. And then also do some self-evaluation. And this is where I'd be interested in some of your opinions also after having looked at some of the data. So the first question we need to ask is, how do we measure the success of an open source project? There's a few metrics that come to mind immediately, and we could start just by having a look at OpenDaylight's stated goals, right? So OpenDaylight's goals, as Inder described in that talk last year, were around 3 main things. The first one, of course, is code. Any open source project has to be measured by the code that's produced. I mean, the code is really what lies at the heart of the project, along with the community. So the community of the thriving community of developers, users around that code base, around the project, also is another indication of whether the project is really alive and kicking, or if it's something that's slowly fading. And then thirdly, there's the adoption, right? So this is adoption by vendors, by taking the code base and using it to deliver products to the market, by users who take the code base and deploy it and use it in real use cases that they care about. And also, what I've added is perception in the community. So the industry perception of the project also plays a role in the adoption, right? How much credibility does the project have in the broader industry is also important to whether or not it can survive and live on and continue to gain interest. Right, so these are the 3 main areas that we'll try to touch upon in the talk today. We'll start with code, we'll look at some of the aspects of adoption, and then finally we'll take some measure of how the community has progressed over the course of the year. there's some people who also will argue that, success in an open source project is just obvious. It's apparent, and you'll know it when you see it. That's all fine, but that's not very satisfying to me personally. I mean, I'd rather have some real data that I could use and real metrics to actually, have a better sense of whether the success is really there, or rather than having a purely subjective metric, right? So let's start with the code. One way to measure, the interest and how much code is coming into the project is around the creation of projects. So when we launched OpenDaylight in April, we started with just 2 projects, right? And you may recall both of them were projects around the controller code base itself, the base controller. And that persisted for some time. In June of last year, we got another project around virtual tenant networking that the NEC team brought. And then over that period of time, that was really sort of the litmus test for the transparency, the governance. A lot of people were looking at the project to see whether it really was going to live up to the standards it claimed around being a transparent and open process and project. And then in July, we had this amazing influx of new projects. So our project count jumped by 9 up to 12 in July. And then since then, we've been adding projects at a roughly almost one per month pace, through the end of the year into the hydrogen release, where we are today in February. And in fact, we actually have 5 new project proposals that are still pending approval that we're going to be, reviewing and approving over the next few weeks in the technical steering committee meetings. And by the way, if you're interested in sort of observing that process, I'll point out for you, those of you who don't know, that the TSC meetings are completely open. Anyone can dial into them, listen, and even participate in them by asking questions and raising their own points. So one measure of code is sort of the number of projects, and you can see that, in just 1 year, we have already 16 projects of varying sizes, right? So some of them are small, but some of them are also very large, and we'll take a look at sort of the size overall of the projects next. Please feel free to stop me if you have questions. I'll kind of adjust for time. So, just before we dive into the code, this picture is a little bit fuzzy, but we've all seen this picture now that hydrogen has been released. But it's always amazing to me, the amount of function that's been provided as part of the platform. I mean, another measure of, the amount of code that's come into the project is just looking at the variety and quantity of function that's there. And through the model that we have, this modular model, it's not like all of this stuff has to be up and running together. We've managed to organize the functionality into a number of additions in hydrogen, and then they can be further organized by adding or removing the modules that you need or don't need. So let's look at the code volume. This is information from a site called olo.net. So if you haven't seen this site, it's actually very interesting. It's a site that tracks basically all sorts of open source projects and has some basic metrics for kind of taking a look at each one. So if you look at their page on OpenDaylight, they actually track the amount of code that's come in. And some of the numbers that were quoted yesterday in the keynote session in the morning by Neela and others around the number of lines of code and number of developers came from this site. So if you recall, we said that it was over 1 million lines of code. And if you look at just the rate at which the codes come in, this curve, it's actually pretty astounding, right? So from April to February of this year, we've generated over 1 million lines of code. And they've done some analysis to remove things like comments and other superfluous things and tried to just focus on the code. And it's also interesting that even though this is an OSGI project primarily written in Java, that there are a number of projects that actually are using C++ and C code and Python code. So it is possible to use other sorts of modules in the project successfully. But of course, Java predominates here. Now, the other interesting thing to look at is from a code perspective is, how does OpenDaylight stack up to other projects? So if you take a look at some other large open source projects, that generate a lot of interest in our community. So many of us work, for example, in the OpenStack community as well. There's talks going on related to OpenStack now. So OpenStack, is a huge project by also any measure, right? Almost 1.7 million lines of code, nearly 2,000 contributors. it is amazing how much it's grown over the time that it's been alive, which is, by the way, much longer than OpenDaylight. And CloudStack, which is an alternative cloud platform, also is very large, 1.5 million lines of code and 250 contributors, also over a much longer time period. And just for comparison, I also put the Eclipse platform, since some folks in our community often look and draw inspiration from the Eclipse project. We know how long Eclipse has been around, and you can see how large it is and how many contributors it has. So then if you look at OpenDaylight, which is highlighted there, it's not that far away from some of these things in just a year, right? It's already over 1 million lines of code. It's in the same neighborhood as some of the larger projects up here. And from a contributor point of view, over 150 contributors is also pretty large. So it's also interesting to compare this to other open source SDN controller projects. So I took Floodlight and the Contrail, Open Contrail projects, and if you compare those two, you can see that OpenDaylight, just from a code perspective, has a lot more contributors as well as code in the project. And even from an activity point of view, as measured by OLO, it's considered to have very high activity. Now, the best thing about the OLO page actually is that it labels Madhu as the manager of the project, which is maybe appropriate, given that Madhu was just voted by his peers as the most valuable developer in the project. So, of course, OpenDaylight isn't really managed by any single developer. It's shepherded by the TSC and the board and the community sort of collectively, right? Okay, so let's turn to adoption. That was the second criteria. I mean, the first sort of criteria or metric regarding adoption is just, from a membership point of view, who wants to be involved in OpenDaylight? If OpenDaylight is drawing members to it, that's an indication at least that there's enough interest in it. And we can get into what are the motivations for different members to join, whether it's just to be associated or to actually actively participate or just to observe. Each member is going to have their own motivations. But without delving into that, just let's see how the membership has changed over time. So we launched on April 8th, 2013. And astoundingly, we had 18 members at launch. I remember that when we started OpenDaylight, we said, OK, if we get 3, we'll be happy and we'll go ahead and launch. And let's try to get at least 3. And it turns out that we were able to launch with 18 members, a mix of platinum, gold, and silver members. And soon after that, it didn't stop. So 5 more members in June. Then we had a little bit of difficulty, and we lost a member in early June. So 1 member dropped off. But after that, we continued at a fairly reasonable clip of adding members. So this is, again, later in June, later in the fall, early this year. And then most recently, we had ContextStream and Cosmos joining. So just if you look at the curve of the membership in OpenDaylight, and these are, of course, just the official members. So to be a member of OpenDaylight doesn't mean that you need to pay the membership fee and become a member formally as an organization. Anyone can be a member. We have lots of individual, unaffiliated participants and members in the project. But it's just interesting to see the level of interest from the industry. And yes, these are mostly vendors. They're not all vendors in the networking industry, which is also interesting, right? We have companies like Red Hat and Microsoft and others who aren't strictly speaking networking companies. But the membership curve has grown steadily, and that's gratifying to see. Yeah.
Any ideas why they're all joining at the lower levels that are contributing new platinum?
Well, I think it's a combination of a couple of things. So as I mentioned, some of the members have different motivations, maybe initially just to observe, to sort of see where they can bring technology to the project, and before committing the resources that are required at the platinum or silver level or gold levels, maybe it makes sense to join at a lower level. The platinum level, I mean, for those of you that don't know, is a pretty serious commitment on the part of these companies, right? We're talking about $500,000 a year, 10 full-time developers, and the expectation of some genuinely valuable intellectual property that's being brought to the table. in the form of code and technology. So it's not a small investment on the part of any of these companies. And the gold membership level requires slightly, not slightly, a good deal, a significantly lower investment, but still a significant investment. And silver is fairly minimal for most of the companies. So, and it's also, by the way, that some of the companies that are joining vary greatly in size. So a small company, a startup, you wouldn't necessarily expect to join at the platinum level at the outset. That's my sort of view of why a lot of the joining happens at the silver level.
Also, if you're going to be a platinum member, wouldn't you have been paying attention early on and joined early on? Like, to some extent, right, the people that are the most interested would have joined there.
Yeah, that's possible. But although I think that we may see some members upgrade their membership over time as well, right? That's also a possibility. Yes, sorry.
We had discussion with companies like Google and Facebook, which are building their own networks. What's their viewpoint around OpenDaylight?
Yes, we have had those discussions. I think what we've seen is there's a good deal of interest because those companies would like to leverage what the community is doing, as they've done in lots of other areas, maybe other than in SDN controllers. And I think the view is, at least from one of the companies you mentioned that we've spoken to, that as OpenDaylight matures and is able to provide the kind of scale and performance and function that they need, they'd be very interested to actually look at using it and hopefully also participating in a more sort of active way. But for now, they sort of feel that it's something that's, OpenDaylight just released its first version. I think it's going to be hard for them to absorb it and really use it at that scale. But they are interested in observing it for now. We're trying to still convince some of those companies, large service providers, and other customers in general, or consumers of OpenDaylight, to join the consortium to provide their guidance and input as well. Yeah. Yeah, so good question. So the question was whether, when projects are brought into OpenDaylight, whether there's some sort of governing body that makes sure that these projects are actually complementary, that they build on each other, that they work together, and so on. So I would have to say, this is, again, my view, my observation, that, that's the function of the technical steering committee, right? So that's their job, is to be the steward of the project and make sure that projects coming in make sense and work together. And as you'll see if you come and observe the TSC's review of the new project proposals, there are a lot of questions exactly around that. Well, we have this function, for example, how would it work with that? Does this really need to be a separate project? Could it be part of an existing project? But I think in the first sort of few months of projects coming in, we have been, a little bit, I would say, low touch with that process, meaning that we want to get function into the project, get code into the project. That's one of the main metrics that we're using, right? And then, shape it a little bit and sort of have the projects collaborate together where there's overlap and figure out how they could work together. So one example is in virtualization. We actually have 2 or 3 different ways of doing network virtualization in the project, right? We have OpenFlow, we have overlays, we have, OVSDB, and we even have Lisp, which is another possibility of creating virtual networks. These things, one could argue that why do we need all these different ways of doing virtualization? But in fact, I think that there's a lot of reason to have different implementations of a particular approach for virtualization, right? So in some environments, OpenFlow makes a lot of sense. Other environments that don't have OpenFlow, overlays maybe make more sense. So one of the other things that we've done in the project, I think so far, and I'm speaking as an observer, is allow function to come in and sort of, shape it afterward. But I think going forward, as we get more and more function in, the TSC will be taking a more maybe active or a little bit higher touch role in, making sure that projects that come in actually do complement, do extend the platform in the directions that we want to see it happen. Okay, let me move forward a little bit. So the other, another metric of adoption. So the first metric we said was, just membership. Who's joining the project? Who wants to play? Who wants to be part of it? The other is, another metric is from a vendor point of view, the project is actually gets a lot of credibility when vendors invest and take the risk of taking the project code base and building a product and trying to sell it and make money out of it, right? I mean, open source, some people's view of open source is that it's not possible to make money. I don't think other companies that are, good at open source understand that it is possible to adopt an open source code base, extend it, add value to it, and make money with it. And we actually have two very high-profile examples, right? The first, of course, is Cisco. With the XNC controller, there were announcements third quarter of last year. XNC code base sort of predates, the OpenDaylight release, but Cisco brought that code base into the project and has also productized it. So you can see that it's viewed as a commercialization of OpenDaylight. And then, of course, yesterday and last week, we saw the announcements from IBM. They're also going to have a release in first quarter. SDN-VE, the new version is also based on OpenDaylight. And I also point out that in the case of IBM, it's interesting because Cisco arguably has a bit of an easier time with productizing this code base because they originated it, right? But when you see vendors who actually pick it up, who didn't have anything to do with the creation, at least of the base controller, and invest in it, harden it, try to productize it, and then offer it to market. I think that is an indication also of adoption, by the vendor community, and hopefully we'll see more of this. But at least we have two examples that we can point to today. And we're at the first release of Hydrogen. Now, what about non-vendor users? A lot has been made of the fact that OpenDaylight has all these vendors in it. It's driven by vendors. Where are the users? Where are the sort of non-affiliated people? And if you actually take an objective look at this metric, it's interesting. So we actually have a bunch of projects by groups or people, individuals, that are completely unaffiliated with any vendor. So one good example is the OVSDB project, which has turned into an extremely popular project in OpenDaylight. It was started at the University of Kentucky by Brent Salisbury, who worked in network operations at Kentucky, along with a student who started this project. They're not part of a company. They're a user of the technology, essentially. You have other organizations like ITRI, Industrial Technology Research Institute in Taiwan. They're also unaffiliated with any vendor, right? They're a research group, and globally outside of the U.S. They started the SNMP for SDN project. That's also part of available, with OpenDaylight, is the Hydrogen release today. So they're another example. We've seen this recent example of Cable Labs. You basically took OpenDaylight, weren't really, it's amazing to many of us who are kind of in OpenDaylight on a day-to-day basis, took the code base, went away, figured out how to write a new plugin, to manage CMTS systems, and to do the COPS policy protocol and the PCMM protocol, build a new southbound, prototyped it, demonstrated it, showed that it worked, and now they're bringing it as a project proposal back into OpenDaylight. And Cable Labs is another kind of R&D organization. They're not a vendor of SDN technology. And then finally, we have a variety of, that's not showing up. Are we stuck in advancing the slide? I know. I'm pressing the button, but it's not changing. All right, they're trying to do something in the ops room. Sorry about this. We had a bit of technical difficulty earlier. I probably could. No, it's still stuck. It's advancing, but it's not.
Go ahead and see if it'll advance. All right, so that works. You want to go past that slide?
Yeah, it's stuck there.
Yeah, so his computer's advancing, but it's not advancing on the screen.
It was doing fine, but that would be a shame if I couldn't show you all the graphs. Okay, there. Okay, we got it, I think.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. So, sorry about that. The point I was trying to make at the end of this slide is that, in addition to these, non-vendor groups, there's also a large number of individual users and developers. So we have projects that came into OpenDaylight that, just started by someone who wanted to do something, right? And we have a couple of examples shown here. And we also have people as individuals who've joined other projects just to contribute to them, completely unaffiliated with any vendor, no interest other than just to advance the technology. So I think, at least I personally feel like this accusation against the project of it being completely vendor-driven and, being a pay-to-play consortium and all the other things that were thrown at the project at the beginning are a little unfair given the data that we see. I mean, there are projects and people involved that are completely unaffiliated with any vendor. Now, not to say that we haven't got more to do here, right? One of the things that's still missing, so the question about, the Facebooks and the Googles and the, other large-scale service providers, certainly, we'd love to have some of them as members. Other industries, whether it's financial services or any other industry that, has a need for SDN technology or use cases, coming in and participating would also be important. But I think at least we have some examples of places where, it's not all vendors. Now, industry perception is another interesting metric, right, as far as adoption. And we said that one of the reasons is, it builds credibility. Having the industry perceive the project to be credible and doing the right thing, advancing the state of the art, advancing the community is important. And in the beginning, when OpenDaylight started, it was considered like a new hope, right? So we had all of these headlines around the market size of SDN and how this new project is going to defragment the community and defragment the industry and build something, commonly across a lot of vendors, which was great. So a lot of hope at the beginning. But then in the middle, we had kind of the skeptics striking back, right? You may recall some of these headlines, both in blog posts and trade magazines. And I don't know if Craig is here today. Craig was here yesterday. He had this comment in his light reading post, before he joined SDN Central, where he's pretty skeptical. I hope that we've changed his mind. I don't know if he's here to. No, he's not here today. But there was a lot of skepticism, and these questions actually weren't unreasonable questions. Some of the questions were around vendor versus user participation. Some of them were, of course, around agenda. You have big industry incumbents like Cisco and Juniper joining the project. What's their agenda? What's their angle? So a lot of these articles are reflecting, those questions. And we went through a period where there was a lot of doubt cast on the project around its openness and transparency. What's the motivation of the players, and so on. But in the end, I think that we actually convinced some of the doubters, right? So at the release of hydrogen, there was actually a lot of interesting things being said, right? So I think that Ethan Banks was here yesterday, right? I don't know if he's here today. In his blog, he wrote, for example, that hydrogen is really helping to bring SDN to the network masses, and even though it's essentially 1.0, that he's going to take a serious look at it. And other blog posts have been kind of similar. And these are people who write regularly about the industry, observers of the industry. And it's nice to see that Black Duck, that's the same folks who run that OLO website I was showing you data from before, actually included OpenDaylight as a 2013 Open Source Rookie of the Year project, along with prominent projects like Docker, for example, that many of us know about and maybe use. Right? So I think from an industry perception point of view, definitely it's been mixed, but I think the most recent sort of things that we're seeing are an indication of maybe some folks are starting to get convinced about the viability and the promise of the project. More what? Well, I actually think it's not clear yet. You'll see at the end. So let's talk about community for the rest of the time before we wrap up. Now, for this piece, what I did was use a project called Stackalytics. So those of you who are involved in OpenStack may have seen this project. It's basically a project that tracks community involvement, which companies are committing, which individuals are committing code and changes, what's the size of the code base, and so on. So I sort of took Stackalytics and adapted it a little bit to point it at the OpenDaylight code base to do a similar kind of analysis. And this is quick and dirty, so I won't claim that the numbers are 100% accurate because there's some cleanup that still needs to be done. But I think it shows the trends, and it's very interesting. So we're able to look at things like what are the code submissions in different projects, who's actually writing reviews for code. I didn't focus too much on code reviews because although that's a good metric for community, I think we need to have a bit more maturity until that becomes more meaningful. Mailing list activity, is there traffic on the mailing list? People actually care enough to spend the time to write emails to each other on different projects? And of course, lines of code. So let's take a look at this, how the project has evolved in terms of the distribution of commits. So when I say distribution, this is basically distribution of the commits, the patches that are coming into the project across companies and across projects, companies and individuals. So when we started in April, May, is pretty dominated by the controller code base, right? You can see that, controller is over 90% of both, the code, and there's one company, Cisco, given that they brought in the code base, dominating the commits, and that persisted, even into June. There are a few additional commits that came in. Most of these are pretty small at that point. But then in July, when we got more projects into OpenDaylight, we started seeing a bit more diversity, right? So it's still fairly dominated by the controller, but as other projects came on board, at least the amount of code, the distribution of commits that are coming in, started to ramp up in other projects. And then through the course of the year, this trend continued. If you look all the way through, you can see that it's, the dominance by a single particular project is certainly being reduced over time. And the controller being the biggest and most, arguably the most complex project, I think it's not unreasonable to expect that, Cisco, as sort of the originator of that project, would be very active in commits. But you can see contribution by modules in terms of code changed quite a bit over the course of the year. And so where we ended up, yeah, go ahead, June.
What's the distribution of the companies within the control?
So I will show you that, yeah. And so where we ended up in January, basically, if you look over the course of the whole project, this is roughly how the distribution ended up. So this is companies, and you can see that, this, I don't know if my pointer is working anymore. Yeah, here it is. This little slice here is basically all the folks who are not affiliated with any of the member companies. So this actually will track member companies. It's not completely accurate, again, because it uses things like emails and other manual input that I had to put in because I know that this person works for that company or something like that. But it's an indication that you have a lot of the companies participating, as well as some non-affiliated folks. Now, the other thing that's interesting to compare is, this is where we ended up after the first release of OpenDaylight, right? So this is the rough distribution of companies, modules to the overall project. And so it's interesting to look at, how does OpenDaylight stack up to something like OpenStack? So this is the distribution for OpenStack after their first release. So if you recall the Diablo release of OpenStack, if you look at the distribution of companies that contributed and, the distribution of commits over different modules, it doesn't look all that different, actually. Right?
That's scary.
Colin hates when I compare OpenDaylight to OpenStack, but I think it's instructive since, it's a project that many of us track and sort of, view as a successful, at least open source project, given the amount of activity in it. So that's an interesting comparison. Now, if you just look at lines of code also, it's interesting where we started in the beginning, all of the code was in one project, right? It was all in the controller project. But by the end, by the time we released Hydrogen, actually there's a good deal of code in other projects. I mean, we have some actually pretty sizable projects that are contributing code other than the controller. I mean, the VTN project, Tai-san is here. I mean, that's a lot of code you guys put in the VTN project. BGP, PCEP, another fairly sizable project. So I think the progress that's been made in bringing code into the project other than the base controller has been significant. Now, this was the question that June was asking about. Let's look at per project, what's the diversity? So another important metric of sort of health of the community and health of the projects is what's the committer diversity on projects. So in OpenDaylight, if you look at the sort of project lifecycle that we've defined as part of governance, a project can become core, meaning a core project elevated to core status after it achieves one of the metrics is it has to achieve some level of committer diversity, which means that it can't have all the committers be from one organization, right? It has to be it has to have participation from a lot of different places. So this is a measure of that, right? So this is taking individual projects and looking at the distribution of commits from different organizations. So the first one, these are some of the good examples. Let's start with those. Integration project. So integration is not, strictly speaking, a new function in OpenDaylight, but it's an extremely, crucial project in the sense that this is where testing, all the build machinery sort of gets done, the system test, all of that stuff is done by the integration project. So the code that comes into this project is all around making sure that we can generate the additions we need. They build the tests that we have for doing system test and integration test are all part of this project. And you can see that this project has fantastic diversity in terms of the number of folks who have been involved in helping to move the integration and test effort forward. Another good example is the OpenFlow plugin project. So we had a project to build OpenFlow 1.3 as part of Hydrogen. And that project also has a number of different companies. It's not as large a set as the integration project, but there's a significant set of commits coming in from a variety of companies. This is, I think, another good example of a project where we had good committer diversity. And then the other one is OVSDB. I think this is another one where we see a good deal of committer diversity coming from not only some of the companies, but there's a huge chunk of independents who are working on this project. So these are individuals who are contributing just because they're interested in the project or they're interested in working with the people who are running the project. So this is another really fantastic example of committer diversity. I will say one thing that we've observed is that projects that, it's obvious maybe for everyone, but I'll point it out anyway. The projects that start out with having buy-in from a few different organizations or a few different individuals, are the ones that obviously get to the committer diversity and are able to keep it. The ones that are brought in by a single organization, so far in OpenDaylight, it's been harder, right, to get to a more diverse set of committers. In other words, attracting additional folks to the project. So this is the good. I mean, this is what we want to see across all of the projects. Now, what about the not so good? Let's start with the controller. Now, you might argue that the controller project, it actually has a large number of commits. But if you look a little bit beyond this, I mean, these are fairly small and minor commits. And the reason I'm kind of focusing on this one is because the controller is such a fundamental project, right, for OpenDaylight. It's the base on which everything is built. So it's important that this project has committer diversity, right? It has to have buy-in and input and participation from a lot of different folks for it to be broadly useful across all of the other projects. And although I think there's still a ways to go on getting more diversity, meaning making these other pie slices bigger, in the controller project, it's much better than where we started. So if you look at where we started, this is where we were at the beginning of the project in April, May. And this is where we ended up. So we made progress, I think, in generating additional committer diversity in the controller project. Now, there are other projects that are completely dominated by a single organization. And this could happen for a variety of reasons. I mean, it may just be a matter of expertise, a matter of interest. It's just a matter of time, right, or maturity. So, we definitely have projects that, are certainly dominated by a single committer. We have to work on getting more committer diversity. And, I'm not picking on any particular project. There's several projects in OpenDaylight that, look a lot like this. But, BGP PSEP, for example, happens to be one of the bigger projects in terms of code. And, just to prove I'm not picking on anyone, I'll also put the, So it's stopped advancing again. What did you do last time?
There's a sync issue with this cable. Go ahead and just turn it back.
No, it got stuck. It got stuck there again. Okay, I think, yeah. So this is the project that I was more involved in, and it has the same problem. So just to prove that I'm not picking on anyone, I'll pick on myself also. We have the same issue in this project. So this, as I said, this applies across many of the projects in OpenDaylight. So certainly for these projects to become core, we need to get greater committer diversity, which means attracting more interest, getting more people to participate in commits on the project. I'll say something briefly about mailing list activity. The one, I think, great thing we've had in OpenDaylight from the beginning, and this is, in May, all of the traffic on the mailing list was about one project, but all of the messages, actually, the posts came from a lot of different people, which is good, I think. A lot of discussion about it, but we only had one thing to talk about, apparently. So
How much is because we all use the controller dev mailing list to work?
yes. So today, though, you can see that there's traffic about a lot of different projects. So it's active. Mailing list activity is, is significant not just on the controller project, but on other projects as well. There's a wide swath of, different companies that participate, or folks from different companies, and of course a large set of independent folks. So, this big chunk here is all the folks who are unaffiliated who are participating in our mailing list. And if you take a look at our mailing list, especially our discuss mailing list, which is sort of the catch-all mailing list in OpenDaylight, it's very active, right? You'll get flooded with emails some days. And just to give kind of kudos to some of the folks who are most active on our mailing list, if you take a look at these people, they're the same people who were nominated for being our most valuable developer and so on. And these are the folks who are posting often just to help people get started, right? You have Luis, who works on integration, Giovanni, who works on the controller, Colin, who's trying to help lots of people on the list get started, Ed, Madhu, all of these people who we all know in the project. It's not surprising to see that they're the top contributors as far as our mailing lists and posts. And there's a number of other folks also. And again, we have a huge number of people who post occasionally but still are active. So let me wrap up here with a summary. So we talked about three things. We talked about code, how much code has come into the project, how many projects have come into OpenDaylight overall. We talked about adoption, which vendors are actually taking OpenDaylight and delivering products to market using it, which users, meaning non-affiliated, either organizations or individuals, are actually taking OpenDaylight and doing something interesting with it or trying to extend its function, how the industry perceives OpenDaylight, how much credibility has it got over the course of the first year. And then finally, we looked at the community, which is extremely important, right? How diverse a community are we building? How active is it? How much participation are we getting from different parts of the community? So just to summarize, and this is my own sort of view of how we did, code, I think, is a place where we did extremely well, right? We've produced a tremendous amount of code in the course of the first release. And some would argue that measuring lines of code in a project isn't necessarily the right metric. It doesn't measure all the subjective things around quality and function and does it do what we need. But you don't have an open source project without code, right? Code is the main thing that makes up an open source project. And on that metric, I think the project's done very well. Now, adoption, so a few things we looked at. I think the fact that we had vendor product shipping based on this code base, and not just one, more than one, is a good thing. I mean, I think that's a really good sign, and we would hope and expect that as the code base matures, we'll actually see more of that. Non-vendor use, that was an open mouth smile. This is a closed mouth smile because I think we still have more work to do there. But it's not all bad, right? So, as I said, the notion that OpenDaylight is dominated by vendors and doesn't have anyone sort of non-vendor user, unaffiliated, is just not borne out by the data if you take a closer look. And then industry perception. So yes, I was being equivocal because I think it's still mixed, right? I think we still have work to do to convince the broader industry that the project is doing the right things and is going to be viable in the long term. And then community, we have a really large set of both formal and informal or non-affiliated members participating in the project. I mean, it's astounding to me how many individuals I've met just at the summit this time who don't work for any company. They just work on OpenDaylight because they think it's a cool project and they want to participate. Either they've hooked up with one of the existing projects or they're thinking about bringing their own project. This is actually not what I wanted to show. OK. The overall number of committers and the diversity of committers, again, it's a closed mouth smile because I think the trend is right, but we still have a lot of work to do, in particular on the per project committer diversity. And this is where I was saying that on the project level, certainly to get more of our projects to be eligible to be core, I think we need to get more diversity, and I'm using that as also a plea to folks here who are interested in existing projects to please join them. I mean, there's a lot of, every project wants more developers to work on it, right, to help advance it. So there's a lot of opportunity to participate and help us increase this metric going forward. So I'll stop there and see if there's any other questions. And thank you again for coming this morning. Yeah. Yeah.
And then also compare it with all the proprietary systems that are being shipped and are being voted with the money, and see whether this project is doing well with the incumbents, and also compare it with non-SDN systems to really see whether that is really taking care of it or the service.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. So the question is really around user adoption, right? Are customers voting with their wallets and pocketbooks as far as actually using the technology? So as you said, it's early to tell because some of the products are just now being introduced to the market, and we hope there'll be more, and we'll have to see if customers actually respond to having an open, standards-based platform as an alternative to some of the other closed and proprietary solutions they have. I don't know of a metric as such, but certainly there's examples in OpenStack where companies have taken it and produced offerings based on OpenStack that have then been consumed. And we have service providers, Bluehost, for example. June gave a talk yesterday about they're using it internally to deliver service to their customers. So in that sense, they're. I mean, yeah, just by their scale, yeah, sure. Yeah.
I have a very regular question for this. So you're using lines of code as a metric to measure success of the project. Are there any ways to measure success? I mean, if you look at OpenFlow, one of the first claims of the Empirical community is that they can do stuff with only a few lines of code, right? Which is exactly the opposite, of what guys are doing. So are there, again, any other ways to measure the impact? What kind of problems are you solving with that code?
Yeah, so remember this code that we, first of all, so the question was about lines of code and does that really make sense as a metric of success? And is there another way to measure the impact of the project? Like how many lines of code do I need to actually write to solve some problem using this platform as another measure? And certainly that's a good metric also. So first of all, I wasn't using lines of code only as a success metric. And the lines of code was really only used to measure how much sort of velocity the project has in terms of building out the platform function. It really doesn't get at all at the question you're asking, which is about, as a user, if I'm writing a new application on this platform, how easy, difficult is it? I mean, do we have the right set of APIs? I mean, that's a fantastic metric also to use. It's much harder to objectively look at, I think. But I think as we start to see more people take hydrogen and try to build real things from it, we'll at least get more anecdotal evidence about that. Yeah, one sec, June. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so Bhushan is pointing out that the XNC product that Cisco released actually has seen a lot of customer interest and in trials and so on. So at least that's one gauge of customers actually voting with at least their interest, if not their dollars yet. And yeah, dollars and interest, I guess. Sorry. And the other metric is, of course, now that the platform is ready, it'll be another good measure of success. What are the applications that we see? So getting back to your question, I think, right? That's another. That'll be another good metric to judge the product. Yes, June. Yeah, so I think you asked this question in your talk also, right? So what is sort of OpenDaylight's plans to integrate and interact with other large open source projects like OpenStack in particular, maybe CloudStack as well, other cloud platforms? I think we've actually made a lot of progress with OpenStack. So there's a lot of cross-pollination, as you might expect, between the OpenDaylight participants and community and OpenStack, certainly. And we have people in OpenDaylight who are also very active cores in OpenStack, and so that bridge really helps us, I think, especially in the Neutron project, provide not only Neutron plugins for integration with OpenStack, but also new proposals to extend Neutron APIs that we are then implementing in OpenDaylight to service those APIs. So I think there is a lot of cross collaboration already, at least in the Neutron part of OpenStack. Not that we couldn't do more, of course. Anyone else? Okay, thanks again, guys.